What's up, everybody? It's Kevin for Elephant Rhino Reacts, and I'm here to do another little segment on the Wheel of Time. So there's been one thing that's been really bothering me as someone who read the books, watching the show so far, and it's that there's no way for the non-book readers to know some of the aspects of history and geography that I know, or that other book readers know, that would really help them with just understanding what's going on in the world and how people are interacting and, what's going on in general. And the only way to know that stuff is to read the books or to have someone tell you. So what I'm going to do is do a really quick timeline of the history and the geography here of the area of the world that we're looking at, right, of the Wheel of Time. And I'm going to do it without doing any plot spoilers, is the idea. Because, again, I don't want to spoil plot for anybody, but I feel like there are aspects of the knowledge that would be so helpful in forming your ideas and, your theories going forward. And it would also help just with your enjoyment of the show, with your immersion in the world, because you won't be worrying or asking questions about things that you would now know. Because they do have a pretty bad habit of just throwing out things that I know what they mean, but they give no explanation to you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a quick, what I've got up right now is the map for the world as stands at the time of our story. And I mentioned in my last video that I was really bothered that they hadn't explained the Blight to you guys yet. And I'm just going to real quick overview it. I'm sure they're going to get into it in the next couple episodes because they have to. But with the map in front of us, there's no reason not to just really quickly talk about this. So this is the map of the nations as stand. The two rivers where we started our story is right in here in the central area next to the central mountain peaks. All right. And it's cut off by the two rivers and then also these mountains. So that's why it's so remote and, people don't bother to go there. So then you have the nations of the west, and you have the nations of the east, and then kind of the nations of the south. Then there are a few sort of central nations, and then you have large areas that are actually not really settled at all anymore. Tar Valon kind of sits in the middle of a large, mostly unsettled area. And then you have up in the north is the Borderlands. This is one of the things that's really bugged me that they haven't actually explained to you guys yet. So the Borderlands are the northern human lands, and beyond the Borderlands is what's called the Blight. And the Blight is where Trollocs come from. So you can see from the map, when there were Trollocs in the two rivers, that is absolutely weird. It's a big question. And it was kind of an opening for them to give you, they should have given you some explanation of Trollocs are supposed to be in the Blight. But everything's been rushed. I get it. It's a rush to get this all out in 8 hours. But there's no way for Trollocs to get from the Blight all the way down to the two rivers without being seen if they're going to travel through all those nations, especially because in what's called the Borderlands, the northern lands, that's where Lan is from. He's from one of the Borderlands. I won't get into that backstory yet either, as much as I really want to, because they haven't gotten into it in the story, so I'll let you guys get to it on your own time. But up here in the north in the Borderlands, it's pretty much just one fortified wall of nations. Those nations exist to hold back the Blight and to fight the Trollocs and to keep them from coming south. Alright, and that's as much as I'll get into it. That's all you need to know. So Trollocs normally are only in the Blight, up in the extreme north of human lands. They aren't seen down in the Southlands. Many of people in the South don't even believe they're actually real. They think they're like a fairy tale. So these are the lands as stands, all right? So we all know what the breaking was at this point. So after the breaking, there were 10 nations that formed in the Westlands. You do already know about Artur and Manetheren, right? We've gone over their stories. Artur is Shadar Logoth. Manetheren is what's now the Two Rivers, right? And much more. But all of the Westlands was under some kingdom, was under one of the 10 nations. And these 10 nations came together and made pacts for peace, led by the Aes Sedai, because Tar Valon already exists. Alright? They all came together and made the Covenant of the 10 Nations, where they agreed to be at peace, and they just agreed on, national borders and ruled themselves. And this worked for about 800 years. And humanity, that's when it built itself back up from being just complete nomads who lived in the wasteland and scrounged for food and water and anything they could find. They actually built civilization back up to something that resembled, the world before the breaking. But after about 1,000 years, that's when the Trolloc Wars started. So the north, from the Great Blight, there was an enormous invasion of Trollocs that overran the borderlands and came down into all the southern lands. And so for 300 years, it was just constant warfare. And we call those the Trolloc Wars. And the Trolloc Wars were just so desperate, mankind once again felt like it was going to end. And the 10 nations, by the end of the Trolloc Wars, when they finally drove all the Trollocs back north into the Blight, the 10 nations were just worn out and they broke up. So when the 10 nations broke up, you have what's called the Free Years. And the Free Years went on for hundreds of years, but you had 29 nations that broke out of the 10 original nations. Alright? So what you're seeing here is the fragmentation of humanity. And these nations are not at peace. So there's plenty of wars between these 29 smaller nations that are left after the Trolloc Wars. The only nations that tend to not go to war with the rest of humanity are the northern ones, because they're too busy fighting on the Blight. So at some point, there's a man who becomes king of Shandal, and his name is Artur Hawkwing. And he ends up taking over this entire continent. He takes over everything except for Tar Valon. Tar Valon is the last place left that Artur Hawkwing can't conquer. But in his old age, he rules for about 25 years. And in his old age, it's arguable, he either lost his mind or something like that, right? But he sent one of his sons off to the west in ships with 300,000 troops, right? Like half of his armies. He sent them off to the west to try and conquer the unknown lands across the ocean. And then he sent a different army east under one of his daughters to the land on the other side of the Aiel Waste that they call Shara, to try and conquer that. And we know that army was destroyed completely. We don't know what happened to his son that went to the west. Alright? But the 29 nations were all united in the consolidation, is what it's called, into Artur Hawkwing's empire. But when Hawkwing died, they pretty much broke back up into the beginnings of the map you'll see now. So there are a few in-between stages, Artur Hawkwing and the map we're looking at now. But what's really important to note is that all this land that is uninhabited now used to be nations. That's 10 nations that just no longer exist and no one lives there anymore. So not only has humankind fragmented, you've still got more than 10 nations in this area, even though there are less people and they're covering less land, right? And there are still wars between these nations. So over time, humanity has gotten more fragmented and smaller instead of getting more and more built up. So the last event on our timeline that you're going to need to know about is called the Aiel War. So roughly 20 years before the events we're watching now, there was a king in this place called Caerhine, and they had a special relationship with a warrior people who live in the deserts over the spine of the world, this mountain range right here, and they're called the Aiel. And these Aiel are really dangerous desert-living warriors. And they had a special relationship with Caerhine, and they'd gifted them the seedling of a tree. And he cut the tree down to make his new throne. And it's called Laemon's Sin. Laemon was the king. Laemon Damodred. Do you get that name? If you watched the last episode, you might understand why people flipped out when they heard that name related to another character. But yeah, Laemon Damodred, he cut down the tree, and that started a war with the Aiel because they came to kill him specifically. And he fled Caerhine, and it became sort of a world war because the other lands of the west came to support him against the Aiel when they came across the Dragon Wall. And they retreated all the way through the Southlands, and then came north towards Tar Valon, trying to flee to Tar Valon. And when they were near Tar Valon, the king of Caerhine was hunted down and killed by the Aiel, and then they immediately left and went back to the Waste. So, the Waste is what you call the area where the Aiel live. It is not the Blight. The Blight and the Waste are different things. I know they're similar names, but they're different things. The Waste is just like a really bad desert. It's not where the Shadow Spawn live. Hopefully, I didn't just bore you all to death, and somebody thinks this is useful information. But, it's just the barest notches on a post, timeline to get us from the breaking to where we are now, and to get you a little bit more familiar with the geography of what we call the Westlands, which is where all this happens. And so, this was Kevin. Hope you guys have a nice day, and see you next time.